David. Hi everyone, my name is Carol, and today we're talking about using clinical science to tackle code review anxiety, okay? All right, so I want to start with a little story. So 2 years ago, I was a psychology professor. So fun thing about being a psychology professor, you still write code, you still do analyses, you still conduct research, but you don't use this thing called GitHub. So 2 years ago, I started at the Dev Success Lab, and I had never seen or used this thing called GitHub. And my manager was like, listen, you need to get ramped up on the GitHub. And I was like, all right, fine. So I pull up the GitHub, and I see that there's this thing called a repo, and I see that you put code in it. So I'm like, okay, I've got a PhD, I can figure this out, obviously. So I copy my entire data analysis workbook, which is like thousands of lines of code, paste that right in and press submit. And I was like, I have done the GitHub, done. So easy. And then I make some changes in my workbook and add a few lines, make some edits, and I have this light bulb moment in my mind where I'm like, you gotta update the repo, Carol. So I copy the entire workbook again and then paste it back into the repo as a new commit, and I press submit again. And I'm feeling super stoked. I'm like, I have done the GitHub not once, but 2 times. I am crushing the GitHub. I'm so stoked. I publicly post in my team channel, and I tag everybody in the channel so that they have to read this for some reason. And I'm like, listen, you all, this doesn't require review, unless you want to, but I just want to publicly say we have my code in GitHub. Feeling really pumped and proud of myself for diving into this. And then I have this little celebrate thing because that's how I'm feeling inside. My teammates who have not seen what I have done yet, react really positively. My manager says phenomenal with a ton of exclamation marks. Again, she has not seen what I've done yet. Some things to note. Really love that I'm this doesn't require review. A lot of unearned confidence here, y'all. And then I also have this moment where I'm that was kind of a clunky process. How are people supposed to know what's new? So I'm TBD if I actually did it right. And of course I did not, right? So I have my first experience with code review anxiety. By the way, I have no idea when this picture was taken or where I am. I just look really upset about these French fries. Anyway, so in my first experience with code review anxiety, I have this very irrational thought, ooh, that was a really stupid mistake, Carol. I should have known better, right? She probably regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent. Super irrational. So what is code review anxiety? This is a fear of judgment, criticism, or negative evaluation when giving or receiving code reviews. Put very, very simply, it's any anxiety you experience during a code review, okay? Now, the thing about code review anxiety is that it's actually really, really common. And anybody can experience this. It's not a junior developer thing, it's not a senior developer thing, anyone can experience this. In fact, in my research sample, folks had anywhere between 1 to 65 years of coding experience. Really big range here. Yeah, I know, I heard you. So just to kind of demonstrate this, I want you to raise your hand if you've ever felt anxious about giving or receiving a code review. Yeah, everyone. Don't lie to me, okay? Yeah, we've all felt it, right? Yeah. Okay, now I want you to raise your hand if you've ever actually talked about that anxiety with your team. Okay, so not as many raised hands, right? So this makes a lot of sense because generally we don't really talk about our anxious experiences like code review anxiety in the workplace. There are some problems with this though. When we don't talk about an experience, it makes that experience quite invisible. And when our experiences are invisible, it makes us feel like we're really alone in them, even though we're not, right? We all raised our hands, but it feels like we're really alone in our anxiety. So very quickly, the ethos of this project became about really showing people, hey, listen, you are not alone in your code review anxiety. You're not crazy, you're not weird, and you're not unskilled for having that anxiety. Because code review anxiety is actually quite normal, right? More importantly, I really wanted to show people, listen, we can actually do something about that anxiety. Because just because something is normal doesn't mean that it can't still be a blocker. It can still get in the way of our lives, our well-being, career progression, etc., right? And that makes a lot of sense. So something to know about anxiety is that one of the primary outcomes of it is this lovely thing called avoidance. Now, in the short term, avoidance works super well, right? You're afraid of this thing, you get rid of it, now you don't feel anxious. You're like, that was amazing, duh, right? But there are some long-term outcomes here. So majorly, avoidance actually makes your anxiety a lot worse in the long term. It also literally prevents you from accessing any benefits of code reviews. So things like improved code quality, security, learning, knowledge transfer, trust, community building, right? All of it just to say, if you want to actually benefit from a code review, we gotta figure out a way to mitigate that anxiety first. So that led me to this question. How do we mitigate code review anxiety in a science-driven way? The science-driven piece was really important to me because if you go into the lovely interwebs, people do talk about code review anxiety, and they talk about ways to manage it. The problem is that these methods often aren't scientific, and they don't work. In fact, they actually make your anxiety a lot worse. So just to kind of get some of those methods out of the way. A common thing you'll see is that folks will say, listen, we're just going to dismiss the anxiety as something that you grow out of as you get more experienced. Problems here. Like we just said, anyone can have code review anxiety. It's not an experience issue, right? Additionally, even if you did just kind of like grow out of this anxiety, right? You don't really want to be like, hey, you feel shitty now. It's gonna be like that for the next few years. Oh well, right? Like, that's not really supportive. You want to provide some sort of support in the interim. The other mistake that I'll see folks make is that they'll focus on coding abilities instead of that anxiety. So they might say things like, hey, listen, here are some things that you can do to write better code. When your code is solid, there's nothing to feel anxious about. And this, of course, is also very, very flawed. You can absolutely feel very, very anxious about something you did very, very well. I often say that anxiety is not merit-based, so it's not something you deserve or earn your way out of. It's this lovely thing that just happens to us all, right? So how do we do this in a science-driven way? Step one as a clinical scientist is you want to develop an empirical model of code review anxiety. This helps us take a kind of targeted approach, identifies the key mechanisms leading to that anxiety, and that lets us know what our intervention should target, right? We're not just throwing things hoping they stick. So here is my model of code review anxiety. This is generated using a path analysis. And you see here that when folks are presented with a code review, if they feel anxious about it, it triggers 3 cognitive biases: low anxiety self-efficacy, high cost bias, and high probability bias. So with anxiety self-efficacy, folks really feel like they can't tolerate or manage their anxiety. They might say things like, oh, I really don't think I can do this, right? With cost bias, they might overestimate the cost or the negative outcome of something bad happening, right? So instead of saying, ooh, made that mistake that really sucked, they're like, made a mistake, pretty sure it's the end of my career, right? Like really, really jump into that. With probability bias, you're overestimating the likelihood of something bad happening. So instead of saying, yeah, like may or may not break production, you're like, ooh, that's definitely gonna break production, right? In our model, we see that anxiety self-efficacy and cost bias actually directly increase code review anxiety. And here, we actually see that anxiety self-efficacy is the primary driver of that anxiety. So what that means is that, at a minimum, if we want to address code review anxiety, we should probably make sure that our intervention is targeting that self-efficacy. We also see that anxiety and probability bias increase avoidance, and here we see that anxiety is the primary driver of avoidance, okay? So if we want to reduce code review avoidance, we really gotta make sure that we're targeting that anxiety. So we have our targets now: self-efficacy, anxiety, and avoidance. Step 2, we're gonna develop that intervention, right? We used a single session cognitive behavioral workshop over Zoom. I chose this method for several reasons. First of all, cognitive behavioral workshops, even in a single session, have been shown to decrease anxiety, decrease avoidance, and improve self-efficacy, our 3 targets here, right? It's also just more accessible and has a lower time burden. It's single session, so folks only have to come one time. It's over Zoom, so folks can tune in around the world. They don't need to travel to this thing. Consistent with cognitive behavioral approaches, the intervention had 4 parts. So first step is we want to teach folks how to actually assess their anxiety. We do this because it's really hard to do something about your anxiety if you don't even know it's happening, right? Kind of a duh. Second step is to reduce any physiological arousal. We do this because it's really, really hard to think or act rationally when you have really intense physiological symptoms. So for example, if you're hyperventilating, you're not like, ooh, I wonder how this code review is going to go, and I better think about it rationally, right? You're like, oh my God, I can't breathe. All I want to do is figure out how to breathe. So we want to manage that first. We then challenge biased thoughts. We do this because anxiety generally functions by making us think pretty negatively biased things about ourselves and the world around us. So when you're feeling really, really anxious, you're not like, man, I am so crushing it, I'm amazing, love myself, right? You're actually thinking things like, wow, I suck, I'm a piece of trash, I suck at this, blah, 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 right? Really terrible things about yourself. And then finally, because avoidance does lead to more anxiety, we want to find ways to reduce avoidance by teaching folks how to proactively engage with their code reviews. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go over all of these things, by the way, but I am going to go over challenging biased thoughts because that is the meat of this intervention. First step with challenging thoughts, identifying them. Same thing here, hard to challenge a thought if you don't even know if you're having it, right? So we bring back sad, distressed Carol here, and she has the thought of, oh, she regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent, right? Just to give you a sense of some other thoughts, these are real thoughts from real participants. One person kind of semi-jokingly was like, this is just how I die. That's what I think when I go into a code review, right? Kind of more strikingly, someone said, I will never get the developer that reviews my code to respect or like me. Another person said, I'm always going to be the least smart and competent person on my team. And then kind of heartbreakingly, a more senior person said, I just have too much experience to be freezed at this kind of task. I'm ashamed, right? You can imagine that if you're going into a code review thinking, this person is never going to respect me, that doesn't really set you up for less anxiety. In fact, it sets you up for more anxiety, right? After we identify our thoughts, we're going to identify any thinking traps. A thinking trap, kind of very basic definition, is a bias that you engage in when you're very, very anxious. We're just going to leave it there, okay? I'm not going to go over all of these. I'm just going to go over the ones that we see in my thought. She regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent. So first, we see some catastrophizing. I predict that something really, really bad is going to happen, even though I don't have any evidence. At no point did my manager say, hey, Carol, did you know that you're pretty incompetent? At no point did my manager say, hey, did you know that I regret hiring you? These are not things that happened, right? I don't have any evidence for this thought. I also engage in dichotomous thinking where I only consider the extremes. I'm either incompetent or I'm amazing. There's nothing in between. I also engage in mind reading. I assume that I know what this person's thinking. I am not a mind reader. I have no idea what this person's thinking. And I also engage in overgeneralizing. I take this single mistake and I see it as indicative of all others. This one mistake means that I'm an incompetent scientist now, right? After this, we're going to want to challenge those thoughts. We don't really want to say, here are some shitty thoughts about myself. Oh, well, right? We want to actually challenge those a little bit. And we do this by asking ourselves some guided questions. So here I might ask myself, okay, Carol, are you 100% sure of this? And the answer is no, I am not 100% sure of this. I might also ask myself, am I placing unrealistic and unattainable standards on myself that I wouldn't expect another person to achieve? And the answer here is yes. It's my first time doing this. I would never assume or expect someone who had never seen or used GitHub before to use it perfectly, right? And then I might also ask myself, does making a mistake really mean that I myself am incompetent? And the answer here, again, is no. Everyone makes mistakes, including superstar coders, superstar scientists make mistakes, right? They're not considered incompetent, it's just like a natural part of learning. Finally, we develop a rational response. This is a more realistic and self-compassionate view of the situation. So instead of thinking, okay, Carol, she probably regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent, I might now say, okay, everyone makes mistakes, it's just a part of learning, right? Bless you. So you might be thinking, okay, so does this intervention work? Like, cool technique, does it work, right? So obviously, we're going to want to test that. So I did this using a randomized controlled trial with 59 developers who experienced code review anxiety. An RCT is a standard method in clinical trials. Basically, what this does is it makes sure that any effects we see are actually due to the intervention. So things like anxiety, sadness, cognitive abilities, thinking, right? All of these psychological experiences, they don't stay stable all day, every day. They just kind of like move around. So we want to make sure that any changes we're seeing are actually because of the intervention, not because things change over time, right? So here are our results. Really, really cool. Our intervention does indeed decrease code review anxiety. So we'll compare the workshop, oh, I don't have a laser, sorry. It's the left-hand graph is the workshop group, and then right-hand graph is the control group, right? And so we see here that there's a larger decrease in anxiety scores for folks in the workshop group, whereas folks in the control group, not much change at all. Same with anxiety self-efficacy. Folks were better able to tolerate and manage their anxiety. So again, our intervention group has a really large increase in self-efficacy, whereas our control group has like pretty much no change. And then finally, our intervention as a bonus increases self-compassion. So folks were kinder and more validating towards themselves. Again, we see that in the intervention group, there's a larger increase in self-compassion. In comparison, the control group, there's like no change at all. Intervention works. Now you're like, okay, now what? Like, I wasn't in the study. Like, how do I take advantage of this, right? So at a minimum, you can actually talk about code review anxiety. Like I said earlier, not talking about our experiences makes us feel like we're invisible in them. And when they're invisible, we feel really alone. And again, it is just so, so important for folks to know that they're not actually alone in their code review anxiety. That they're not crazy, they're not weird, they're not unskilled, right? Code review anxiety is in fact normal. And it is so, so important for folks to know that they can actually do something about that anxiety. Just to kind of highlight this, here are some quotes from former participants or folks who read the paper but didn't even participate in the study. So one person said, "I left having never felt so seen. To be in a Zoom room with other developers who experienced similar levels of anxiety was truly priceless. Even after the session ended, a few other devs and myself stayed on with Carol for about 20 more minutes. The psych safety of that Zoom room felt special, and I wanted to absorb it for as long as possible." I should mention that this happened in like multiple sessions. Folks stayed longer. It is really powerful for folks to feel like they are not alone in their anxiety, that what they're experiencing is not weird, that it's normal, right? Another person said, knowing that code review anxiety is an almost universal experience has really helped with some feelings of imposter syndrome. Acknowledging that it's a real thing, knowing that other people, regardless of experience or skill, have similar thoughts and experiences, and having techniques to deal with it has been incredibly empowering and valuable. Again, knowing that this is normal is really powerful. Knowing that there's something you can actually do about it is also really powerful, right? And then finally, someone who was not in the study, but just read the paper, somehow found the paper, read it, and then reached out, shared the paper with their team, and they were like, we ended up having a few people commenting along the lines of, "I'm so glad to hear this isn't just a me problem," right? Again, talking about anxiety can be really powerful. If you want to go beyond that, there is also a code review anxiety workbook. This is a self-guided and self-paced workbook that distills the intervention that we tested into a workbook for you. It is freely available. You can download it, write on it, just bookmark it, whatever you want. Work on it by yourself, work on it with a team, whatever, right? This is yours to use. So, TLDR. One, read the paper if you want and download the workbook. But first of all, know that code review anxiety is normal. It impacts folks across experience levels. It's not a junior developer thing, right? It's everybody. Code review anxiety can also be a blocker. It leads to things like avoidance and procrastination, and it's maintained by low anxiety self-efficacy. And then finally, and most importantly, we can indeed do something about it. Just a single cognitive behavioral workshop can reduce that anxiety, increase self-efficacy, and also increase self-compassion, which is pretty dang cool, right? And a major thank you to my code review anxiety teammates, Kristen Foster Marks and Kat Hicks, both of whom supported this project. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you all in office hours. Thanks.